Buildings remember things people forget. Lecture halls remember at the chalkboard, where a straight line is either straight or it isn't, and everyone in the room can see the difference. Thaddeus Kovarik had spent 24 years learning to read that difference inside Hendricks Hall, a 1951 lecture building at Belcourt University, whose largest room, Lecture Hall A, seating 300, had hosted introductory science courses continuously for over 70 years. He was 63 now, building services technician, responsible for the hall's fixtures, its rows of fixed seating, and the enormous sliding chalkboard panels that generations of professors had covered in diagrams and equations since before most of their students' parents were born. He had learned to notice the chalkboard's quiet habits from a man named Percival Ashby, who had kept Hendricks Hall for 22 years before him, and who believed, without ever needing to defend the idea, that a fixture drifting out of level in a perfectly rigid room was never drifting on its own. Thaddeus started at Hendricks at 39, hired as Ashby's assistant during a period when the university was debating a broader campus renovation that never quite materialized for Lecture Hall A. Ashby was 60 then, precise and unhurried, a man who carried a small line level in his shirt pocket the way other men carried reading glasses. "A room like this doesn't have opinions," Ashby told him. During Thaddeus' second week, the two of them standing at the base of the great sliding chalkboard while morning light came to the hall's high, clear-story windows. Poured concrete, steel frame, masonry walls. It's supposed to hold whatever shape it was built in forever. So when something in a room like this stops staying level, that's not the room being difficult. That's the room telling you it isn't the shape it used to be. Ashby kept a small logbook, recording something almost nobody else at the university ever noticed. A seasonal measurement of how far out of level the chalkboard's left-hand panel sat. Checked with his line level at the start of every term. The university never asked this of him. He did it the way some men keep a weather diary, because the habit of noticing felt like its own kind of care. Thaddeus remembered the first term. He watched Ashby take the measurement, standing on a short stepladder with the line level pressed flat against the panel's edge, murmuring the reading to himself before writing it down. He'd asked, half joking, whether anyone besides the two of them would ever care about a fraction of a degree on an old chalkboard. Ashby had climbed down from the ladder before answering. Folding the level clothes with the same unhurried care, he gave everything. "Nobody cares about a fraction of a degree," he'd said. "They care about the whole degree it eventually becomes. Somebody has to be counting the fractions before that happens." When Ashby retired, he left Thaddeus a logbook, along with a piece of advice Thaddeus had carried for 24 years since. Watch the low corner. A wall in a room like this doesn't get sloppy. If it's tilting, something behind it has already decided which way to lean. Hendricks Hall was a solid, unglamorous building by design. Poured concrete floors, load-bearing masonry walls, and a steel-framed roof built to the confident structural standards of the post-war decade. Lecture Hall A occupied nearly the entire ground floor of the building's east wing. Its 300 fixed seats rising in a gentle rake toward the back rows, all of it facing a single wall dominated by sliding chalkboard panels that could be pushed sideways on steel tracks to reveal fresh writing surface beneath. Thaddeus knew the hall the way he knew his own house. He knew which rows of seats squeaked in humid weather, and which lecture hall door hinge needed oil before the fall semester's crowds wore it dry. He knew the exact echo the room produced when it was empty, a low, hollow resonance that vanished the moment 300 students filled the seats. He knew the chalk dust smell that lived permanently in the room no matter how thoroughly it was cleaned, a scent that had probably outlasted every piece of furniture the room originally held. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that the chalkboard's leftmost sliding panel had never once hung perfectly level. It wasn't dramatic. Students filing in for an 8 a.m. lecture never noticed it. But professors over the decades had quietly learned to compensate, writing with a slight upward tilt on the left-hand panel that nobody in the department had ever fully explained, a habit passed from professor to teaching assistant to the next generation of teaching assistants without anyone tracing it back to its origin. New instructors simply absorbed the tilt the way you absorb any local custom, without asking why it existed. One young physics instructor, newly hired and unfamiliar with the tradition, had once asked Thaddeus directly why everyone in the department wrote crooked on that one panel and nowhere else. Thaddeus had shown her the low corner, and she had laughed, delighted, and said it was like the building had its own accent. She used to tilt herself within a week, the way everyone eventually did, and never asked about it again. Thaddeus had written her phrase into the logbook margin that evening, an accent, because it was closer to the truth than she probably realized. An accent came from somewhere. It didn't invent itself. Ashby's earliest entry about it, dated 1979, read, "Asterisk left panel out of level again, same corner low. Track releveled, bracket shimmed. Comes back within a year. The track is fine. The wall behind it is not staying still. Watching it, asterisk." Thaddeus had read the entry during his first winter with a logbook, sitting in the small services office off the hall's rear corridor, and felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Ashby had noticed something real. Ashby had never solved it. And Ashby had kept measuring anyway, term after term, patient enough to record a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Thaddeus continued the seasonal measurements without ever being asked to. Every term, the same line level against the same panel, the same low corner confirmed. Every releveling held for a while, and then quietly surrendered. In his 10th year with the logbook, Thaddeus began doing something Ashby's earlier entries had never quite included, recording the exact degree of tilt rather than simply noting the panel was out of level again. It took him nearly a decade of those precise readings to see what Ashby's simple notes could only imply. The tilt wasn't holding steady between relevelings. It was worsening, a fraction of a degree more each year, slowly enough that any single term's reading looked unremarkable, unmistakable once laid across 10 years of careful measurements. The same corner, always low, never the reverse. He sat with that realization one quiet evening in the services office, Ashby's oldest logbook open beside his own decade of readings, the empty hall beyond the wall holding its particular hollow silence. If the tilt had been worsening since Ashby's first 1979 entry, the corner had once sat far closer to level than anyone teaching the room today had ever personally seen. Something behind that wall wasn't simply persisting. It was moving patiently in one direction for over 40 years. He thought about every professor who had ever tilted their handwriting to compensate without asking why, about every teaching assistant who had learned the trick from someone older and passed it along without a second thought. An entire departmental tradition built quietly on top of a building slowly leaning, and nobody but 2 facilities technicians ever curious enough to ask what the tilt actually meant. He wrote a new entry beneath Ashby's oldest one, in the same plain hand. Asterisk 10 years of precise. Readings confirm the tilt is not stable. It is worsening, slowly, consistently. Same corner, every measurement. 'Cause still unknown. Continuing to watch, asterisk. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest were available to him. Thaddeus had a theory, in his 14th year, that the cause might simply be where in the chalkboard's original sliding track hardware, decades of the heavy panel being pushed back and forth wearing the track's mounting brackets unevenly, enough to introduce a slow tilt that no amount of shimming could permanently correct. He spent the better part of summer replacing the entire track assembly with new steel hardware, carefully leveled and torqued to specification, convinced he had finally found something a hardware store could permanently fix. The tilt returned within a year, in the same corner, at almost exactly the rate his charted trend predicted. The new track held level for a term, and then began drifting exactly as the old one had. The hardware had nothing to do with it. Whatever was tilting wasn't the track. It was a wall the track was bolted to. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the logbook, in the same unembellished style Ashby had taught him, without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Asterisk track hardware theory. Ruled out. Full replacement installed. Tilt returned within a year at the predicted rate. The track is not the source. The wall behind it is not staying still. Back to unexplained. Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the hardware to be the answer. Mechanical, replaceable, a summer's labor and a closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived inside the chalkboard wall itself, a section of masonry nobody had opened since 1951. In a building everyone assumed was simply too solidly built to have any secrets left. The renovation announcement arrived in his 21st year. The university approved a modernization of Lecture Hall A, replacing the aging chalkboard with a suspended digital display system, Large screens mounted on structural anchors drilled directly into the same chalkboard wall, positioned according to the building's original 1951 drawings. The university framed it as a straightforward upgrade, swapping one wall-mounted teaching surface for a more capable one. Thaddeus read the project brief and felt an old unease sharpen into something closer to urgency. A chalkboard was light, a sliding panel of slate on a steel track, easily shimmed back into position every time it drifted. A suspended digital display, by contrast, would be heavy, rigid, and anchored with hardware engineered to carry real structural weight without any tolerance for movement. If the wall behind the chalkboard had been quietly leaning for over 4 decades, the new anchors were about to be driven into the one section of masonry that had never stopped moving. He brought Ashby's logbook, along with his own decade of precise measurements, to the renovation's installation team. The lead installer, a capable and straightforward man named Reuben Castell, inspected the chalkboard wall visually alongside Thaddeus, checking for cracking, staining, or any visible sign of structural distress. He found none. "The wall looks solid," Castell said, running a hand across the masonry near the low corner. "No cracks, no bulging, nothing that would concern me on a walkthrough. Honestly, the panel's historical tilt reads to me like a minor, cosmetic hardware issue with the old sliding track, and it's moot anyway, because the new display system uses entirely new anchor hardware. Whatever quirk the old track had doesn't carry over." "I already replaced the track," Thaddeus said. "New hardware, properly leveled. The tilt came back within a year, at the same rate it's been worsening for 40. It isn't the track. Something behind this wall has been leaning since before either of us was born, and it's still leaning." Castell considered that, and to his credit, didn't dismiss it outright. "I don't have another explanation for a trend like that, but a visual inspection that shows no cracking or distress doesn't give me grounds to treat this wall differently in the installation plan. The renovation scope is a display system, not an open-ended structural investigation." It was a reasonable position, and Thaddeus didn't have an engineering credential to argue against it. What it was over 40 years of one corner drifting in one direction, a ruled-out theory, and a growing conviction that a wall could look perfectly sound to the eye while still quietly moving in a way no visual inspection was ever built to catch. Thaddeus didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. Wood Castell was right, and 40 years of careful measuring amounted to nothing more than an old sliding track's cosmetic quirk. A habit he and Ashby, between them, had slowly turned into a structural mystery through nothing but 2 careers of inherited attention. He had wanted, for years, for the worsening tilt to mean something real. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually mattering. He pulled Ashby's oldest logbook out one more evening and reread the 1979 entry under the service's office lamp. Asterisk, the track is fine. The wall behind it is not staying still. Watching it. Asterisk. Ashby had never known the cause either. He had simply kept watching, term after term, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Thaddeus had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether it could stand against a clean visual inspection and a reasonable installer's judgment. He didn't have the cause confirmed. But not having it hadn't stopped Ashby from writing the first entry in 1979. It wasn't a reason for Thaddeus to stop pushing now. Not with rigid new anchors about to be driven into a wall his own decade of readings said was still quietly leaning. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a masonry specialist before the anchor installation began. Not to delay the renovation, he made clear only to look inside the chalkboard wall, while it was still simple to open a small section rather than after heavy new hardware had been driven into it. The specialist was a woman named Priya Anand, who assessed older masonry wall assemblies for hidden construction defects. She reviewed Hendricks Hall's original 1951 drawings alongside Thaddeus's decades of measurements, and she brought a small endoscope camera and a thermal imaging tool to examine the wall's interior through a narrow access point cut near the low corner. What she found explained over 40 years of a tilt that nobody had ever been able to name. The chalkboard wall, like most masonry walls of its era, was built as 2 separate widths, an exterior brick facade and an interior masonry backup wall. meant to be tied together at regular intervals with metal wall ties, locking the two layers into a single rigid assembly. The endoscope camera, threaded through the small access opening, showed no ties anywhere near the low corner, a coordination gap between the original trades, never caught by any inspection in 1951, and never recorded because the contractor's original punch list documentation had been lost decades before Ashby ever picked up his first line level. Without ties, this backup would have never been properly connected to the exterior facade, Priya explained, showing Thaddeus the endoscope footage at a folding table in the hall. For 70 years, this section has been free to move on its own, and it has, leaning inward very gradually under ordinary seasonal thermal cycling. The brick outside expands and contracts with the weather, without ties holding the backup wall to it. The interior would have been slowly following its own path instead, leaning a little further every year. That's why it's always the same corner, Thaddeus said. That's why it's always the same corner, Priya said, and why it's never reversed. A properly tied wall wouldn't be able to move like this at all. This one's been free to lean since the day it was built, and nobody wrote it down because nobody ever looked. Thaddeus thought about every professor who had ever tilted their chalk to compensate, generation after generation, treating a structural defect as a charming local quirk without ever knowing that's exactly what it was. 70 years of an entire academic department unconsciously adjusting its handwriting to match a wall's private, patient decision about which way to lean. Ashby called an opinion once, he said. Said a room like this doesn't have one. I think he had it backwards. This wall's had an opinion since the day it went up. It just took 70 years for anyone to actually ask it what it was. Priya's findings went to the renovation committee within the week. Reuben Castell reviewed the endoscope footage and the thermal scan personally and called Thaddeus afterward. You were right to push for this, Castell said. A visual inspection from the room side would never have caught a missing tie inside the wall assembly. If we'd anchored a rigid display system into that section as planned, we had been driving load-bearing hardware into it with that still actively leaning. No allowance anywhere in our plan for a wall that's been moving in one direction for 70 years. The installation plan was revised. The chalkboard wall's low corner was opened, properly tied to the exterior facade for the first time since 1951, and allowed to stabilize before any new anchors were set. The suspended digital display went in afterward, mounted to masonry that finally matched what the original drawings had always assumed it would be. Belcourt University Facilities Office filed a formal note in its permanent records, crediting both Percival Ashby's original 1979 observation and Thaddeus's 24 years of continued measurement as the reason a hidden construction defect had been found and corrected before rigid modern hardware locked 70 years of unexamined movement into place for good. Thaddeus kept Ashby's logbook. He added a final entry beneath the oldest one before moving it into the university's facilities archive. Asterisk chalkboard walls low corner tied and stabilized this year. Missing wall ties traced to an uncaught 1951 construction gap, documented to the panel's tilt since 1979. First term on record with no drift. Percival, you were right. The wall was never sloppy. It was leaning because nobody had ever asked it to stop. Neither of us knew why for a very long time. Asterisk. He stood at the base of the new display system on a quiet morning before the fall term began, watching the screen-mounted flush and level against the wall. No compensating tilt required. No old habit passed down to a new generation of teaching assistants who would never need to learn it. He thought about Ashby, standing at the same wall decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that a room like this doesn't have opinions, and that when something stops staying level, the room is telling you it isn't the shape it used to be. Thaddeus had carried that sentence through 24 years, through a ruled-out hardware theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of quiet measurement had amounted to anything more than habit. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep watching the low corner, the way Ashby had taught him, until the wall finally admitted, after 70 years, exactly which way it had been leaning all along.